I was born in 1996, 2 years after Yahya Jammeh seized power in a military coup. Jammeh would end up ruling Gambia as a dictator for 22 years, almost the entire length of my life. As a child, I learned that Jammeh was the president through popular songs, among many things. I can still remember the echoes of voices of adults and children singing the praises of our beloved president. When we turned on the TV, we would only see his face. And each time his face appeared, so did all of his presidential titles. Every Gambian can recite these from memory. His Excellency, Sir Professor, Dr. Alhaji, Yahya Abdul Aziz, James Junkung Jammeh, Nasiruddin Babili Mansa. I also remember when we were in nursery school and feasting on large servings of free food paid for by the president as an annual gift to struggling schools. We didn't have books or desks to use at school, but the president, as he would call it, would dash us with his presidential party money. The first time I personally saw Yahya Jammeh in person was from a distance. He came all the way to my city of Brikama for a political rally, an hour away from Banjul. I remember standing there with a mango in my right hand and salt and pepper in the other as his motorcade passed through my neighborhood. Crowds lined up to watch him. He threw us t-shirts, biscuits, and so on. I experienced his might and power on full display, but I never thought I'd ever come in close contact with him. In my social circles, people rarely never speak about the president in negative terms. The first time I genuinely and consciously understood that I was living in a dictatorship was around 2010. I was a teenager volunteering at the Red Cross, and I overheard an argument between two people, and one of them was speaking in opposition to the president. I was surprised. On other occasions, like in schools, I noticed my teacher, Mr. Adaye, would refer to Canada as a democracy, for example, and Libya as a dictatorship. But he will never specifically categorize Gambia. He would often say, we were able to figure out for ourselves in what type of government we lived in. Slowly, these things began to click in my mind and sparked my curiosity. But being from a poor family, the idea of going to the internet cafe to Google the president was a luxury I could not afford. Like most of my friends, we kept our bubble of school activities, theater, debate competitions, popular culture and sports. And then I headed to college. My friends inspired me to participate in a beauty pageant organized by the president's office. It was terribly exciting. I was happy because it was an opportunity to win a full scholarship to any university in the world and funding for community projects of my choice. And so on December 5th of 2014, I stood on a nationally televised stage with 22 other contestants. And I won. My family and friends cheered with joy as I talked about my plans for community projects. When I accepted the crown from the previous winner, I remember looking into the crowd with tears of joy streaming down my face. My dreams of pursuing my studies and education were becoming a reality, and the future appeared full of possibilities. All the winning contestants were required to pay a courtesy visit to the president. There I was, months after winning, sitting in the State House of the Gambia, meeting the president along with other girls. From Yaya Jammeh, we had words of encouragement, advice, and felt his concern for our future, genuinely. Looking back now, that moment felt safe. It felt right. It was everything a young woman should expect from the top government officials of her nation. Over the next months, I received frequent invitations to join the president at public functions with other girls, and then to meet him to discuss the projects that we were working on. I often felt pressure to accept such invitations. For instance, armed military having to pick me up at the rehearsals when I decided I did not want to go. But even so, I considered Jammeh a father figure. Then in May of 2015, the president invited me to discuss community projects. And suddenly he simply said, "I want to marry you." Like a command. I giggled, thinking it was a prank. And then I said, "How? No. You're my father's age." I was thinking to myself, hell no. The president coldly said, "I don't think you understand what I mean, but I'll give you more time to think about it." The president of an entire country found my no to be disrespectful. Too much ownership of self coming from a nobody. And so a man who could not accept rejection from a young woman decided that he would inflict pain by drugging and raping me. He raped me. It's a sentence I could only say years later. I felt broken, devastated, and violated. I was ashamed and could not go to anyone, not even my mother. Not because I was scared that she would not believe me, but because I knew she could not do anything about it. But worse, I was being followed and even asked to be taken back to him again, taken back to that moment. My next instinct was to run away. Through boats and being in cars filled with cattle and disguised in my hijab, I fled to Senegal and later obtained asylum in Canada, a place I call home now. I found myself in a city with no family, having to start from scratch and dealing with the weight of what has just happened, knowing I could not say anything. And from the day it happened, and for the first 2 years, I kept telling myself it did not happen at all. I told myself life goes on. And I didn't want people to know this happened to me because I thought, just like many other survivors, that I am better than this. I was also afraid. I feared Jammeh, and I feared what might happen to me and to my family. I was safe, but they weren't. From exile, it was very clear that Jammeh was a brutal dictator, and what he was capable of, arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial killings, and forced disappearances were all commonplace in the Gambia. Jammeh once said he would rule the Gambia for 1 billion years and only God could remove him. But deeper than that, I didn't want to be seen as the person who was raped by the president. And so I pretended like my life went on. But soon I realized that I wasn't living. My life was on pause. I have been this vibrant young person interested in theater and community work, but that girl was gone. For some reason, I felt like I owed it to myself and the perpetrator to hide the story, to protect our little secret. When I decided to get help, I went to therapy. And I realized how important it is to talk to someone who can listen and not judge. That led me to so many questions. What does a survivor in Gambia do? If you cannot confide in your mom or your grandmother, how does that even work? Where do Gambian survivors, victims go to for help? I jumped on my computer to search for survivors in Gambia. I searched for articles and tried to find people who had shared their stories. I could not find a single person who had their face behind their stories. Not a single rape survivor in the Gambia that was visible. I remember sitting there and starting to ask myself these questions and staring at statistics from World Health Organization and United Nations. All of these statistics, but no actual human representation. I came across a few websites where people could go to anonymously share their stories. And there I read hundreds and hundreds of stories of sexual abuse survivors and stories that sounded familiar. Stories of abusive uncles and workplace harassment. I remember breaking down and saying, we are here, a lot of us, in a country of less than 2 million people. It was a life-changing moment for me, staring at the screen and realizing that if I were back in the Gambia and this happened to me, speaking out would not be an option, regardless of who my perpetrator was. This jolted me out of my previous mindset. I saw a picture bigger than myself and my desire to protect my image and purity and sanctity, confined within the expectation of religion and society. I felt like I did not want to be another statistic. Speaking out anonymously was easy, but not enough. There were already so many anonymous stories out there. And if people can't see the human being behind the story, then they're just anonymous tales dehumanized. So I decided that I will not hide behind fear anymore. That I was going to take back that power, no matter how difficult that might be. My power now. So I started talking to my therapist, and she warned me about the consequences of speaking out. You're going to be buried and re-victimized millions more times, she said. I had to build my strength to re-survive again and again and again. It took me more than another year and a half before I could feel like I was ready. Meanwhile, it was 2016 and the next presidential election was coming up in the Gambia. With the help of Gambian diaspora, opposition leaders came together to support a single candidate to run against Jammeh. We all expected Jammeh to rig the elections and win again. He had cheated every time. It was unthinkable that he would allow the true election results to be announced. But against all odds, Barrow won the elections. Gambians welcomed the news with even more disbelief when Jammeh appeared on TV to concede to Barrow. For a few short weeks in early 2017, Jammeh, however, defied regional and international appeals to step down whilst cracking down on protest led by the hashtag Gambia Has Decided campaign. Troops and protesters flooded the streets. Worried Gambians abroad calling their families day in and out. And I was one of them, across the Atlantic Ocean in my Toronto apartment. Finally, the dictator was forced out by a military intervention of troops mandated by the West African regional bloc of countries. Jammeh was gone, accepting defeat and exile in a different dictatorship, Equatorial Guinea. I remember feeling happy at the possibility of freedom, the end of life as a refugee, and longing to be in my mother's arms again. I became the first survivor of sexual violence to speak out without hiding my identity. My publicized New York Times story and multiple human rights reports inspired the hashtag I am Toufah, similar to the Me Too movement. To my horror, I learned of 3 other women with similar stories, and to realize that I was not alone. And in July of 2019, I led the first ever march against sexual violence in the Gambia. Dozens of men and women joined as we marched peacefully in the streets to make our voices heard. It was an incredible milestone. The Gambia has since set up a Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commissions to investigate the crimes of the Jammeh regime, and I told my story as vividly as I could to a society that never discusses rape. One of the things I realized in telling my story is that local languages in the Gambia don't have terms for rape or sexual violence. For example, when I asked my youngest sister if she knew how to say rape in Fuller, our language, she could only scratch her head. Literally, only my grandmother knew the words. And those words are rarely used, and when used, they sanitize sexual violence. The way to say someone raped me is to say someone robbed off of me, or someone fell on me. Sometimes a girl might speak up, but with this language, she will not be taken seriously. And many a times, the response is, get over it. Fall right back at him. This is how we express violations on women's bodies. Imagine me walking to my mom to say, he fell on me. The only thing that does is diminish what has happened to me. It completely erases my story. It turns assault into microaggressions. It also sounds so ridiculous. It could even be funny. Jammeh fell on me. You've seen his photos. Survivors of sexual violence cannot get justice when the jury hears about someone falling on you. A culture cannot relate to something that doesn't exist in its language. In free societies, there are conversations about different types of violence, both physical and emotional. But in our society, where I come from, we do not even have the proper words for the harm done to our bodies. These are all reasons why I launched the Toufah Foundation to help create a safer environment for rape survivors in the Gambia. Most oftentimes than not, survivors are told to take the back seat, while people who have never directly experienced sexual violence or understand the complexities of the issues try to speak for them. With my foundation, we are trying to change that. For all of our initiatives are created by and for survivors. And don't get me wrong, the challenges are daunting. For example, Gambia does not have a database on sexual reporting. And we're trying to build this. We do not also have simple things like rape kits in our hospitals. When women walk into hospitals, they're given painkillers and asked to go home. Oftentimes they're not home to their perpetrators. The Gambia does not have a single women's shelter in the country. After defying a husband who beats you and abuses you, where do you go? If you go to your parents' home, they will tell you to go back to your marriage and honor the family's name and integrity. This is why a lot of women would rather stay with an abusive husband than say anything. Women and girls would rather stay in homes of uncles and teachers who raped them rather than say anything. How do I come out and seek justice whilst homeless and caring for kids on top of that? So remember, when we ask women to come out and speak and tell their truth and seek justice, what responsibilities do we have? This is why a women's shelter is not only important, but necessary. Personally, when I arrived in Canada, I lived in a women's shelter. I know what it means to live there. I know what it has done for me. So I would like for my legacy to be in building the first dedicated, fully functioning women's shelter for survivors of sexual violence. We are campaigning for legal codification of fitting terms of sexual violence in all major local languages in the Gambia. We continue to lobby for changes in current legislation for sexual offenses. We don't have a lot of experience or a long track record of bureaucracies and technicalities, but we have the strength of determined survivors. We know what needs to be said and done. We know what is needed in order to accomplish this groundbreaking work. We invite you to join us. Thank you.